Well, Jonathan, today's a big day. This is an incredible day. We are finally bringing to a close an epic story, Jacob's story, our story, um, in our journey, beginning back in Genesis chapter 25, and now we've come all the way through, and this is going to be our last episode. We're coming into Genesis chapter 35. Wow. How are you feeling today, Jonathan?
This again, Jacob. That's what I have to say about it at the moment. A lot more in a moment, but this is a really affecting, with an A to me, this story. Uh, the way that Moses gives it to us here, and I think that that'll be a surprise actually because you read it and it kind of looks like a bookend and maybe not as notable as some of the other stories, but actually, what I think we're going to see is that the themes and large motifs of Jacob's life come together uh, into a beautiful tapestry that finally brings us to Christ. And it's breathtaking in that way, humbling and breathtaking in that way.
Yeah, it is. So this is the Noble podcast. This is season 10. This is the very last episode on Genesis 25 through 35. And if you're picking up this very last episode, maybe you're a new listener, you got to go back and listen to the rest of the season because this is such a powerful story. This transformation that we've seen in Jacob's life. I think, Jonathan, we're going to read it, right? We're going to take verses 16 to 29, kind of an epilogue to Jacob's life. And a lot of different things come together, like you said, in in a moment. Do you want to read it or should I, Jonathan?
Go ahead.
All right, so here we go. This is the NIV, starting at verse Genesis 35, starting at verse 16. Then they moved on from Bethel. While they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Israel moved on again and pitched his tent beyond Migdal Eder. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. Jacob had 12 sons. The sons of Leah, Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Rachel's servant Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Leah's servant Zilpah, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob, who were born to him in Padan Aram. Jacob came home to his father Isaac in Mamre near Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed. Isaac lived 180 years. Then he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of years. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. You want to
Yeah,
take
there
us
you
into it,
have it.
Jonathan?
Yeah, there you have it. I think I'd like to lead us into it by just with the pastoral reflection. And it goes like this. I've learned by hard experience that it's really important to bring closure to stories. And I've learned that the hard way because I've told stories and I haven't closed them out. necessarily always. And I remember those circumstances. Like I told a story and I didn't tell the end of it because I had already made the point I want to make. And then everybody's coming out of church asking me about the story and not thinking about Jesus. What happened in the story? So getting closure to stories is important. Um, and I wish that we could give that today. I wish we could share that today. Um, you get an ending, you get an ending. But one thing that you will not get with the story is perfect closure for Jacob in a sense. You'll get a closing, you will get a conclusion, but not closure. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, especially with this story.
Boy, this is such an interesting um compendium or anthology of stories that some of the scholarship on this, Jonathan, they they get a little bit accusatory, and that they'll be like, I read one commentator, for example, who said that what you have here is a heap of blocks. So you have these little vignettes, three of them with a list. And the scholars are like, oh, these are just the leftover stories, sort of, that didn't have a better place. And the editors of the Old Testament just threw it all in there. Or another commentator called this a list of the miscellaneous things. So what they're and by the way, I totally disagree with this. But what they're saying is it's kind of like a rummage sale, and over on the side is this plastic bin that says miscellaneous things, and you can just find a bunch of, like, it's like your junk drawer. It's like this is like the biblical junk drawer, where you go in there and you have all this stuff that really has no connection to the next thing that's in there. And there's enough scholars that look at this um in that way, and they're like, what, why are we being told these particular stories? And um no, we're not going to get the closure that we want, but this is going to be, I'm going to call it an ending. He's going to bring things together, I think, um in a beautiful way, not necessarily for Jacob, but for us. And it's gonna help us to see how the way that life really is, um, using this junk drawer of stories. uh, I call it three scenes in a list, because that's really what we have, or three vignettes, or three stories and a list. And each one of them come with some power.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. We get these very affecting scenes. And the first scene that we get is with Jacob's wife, Rachel, and she goes into labor and begins to give birth. And we get the language in there that we should not pass over, that she has great difficulty, we're told. She has great difficulty. And in the sparse prose of the Old Testament, this should really stick out to us as heavily descriptive language. She was having great difficulty. And I'm going to try to be a sensitive man and not try to talk about a woman's experience, but just let that stand. When the Bible says that this was great difficulty, it is by no means minimizing other deliveries. Every birth is happens with great difficulty in a certain sense, but this is something that heaps up from there. Our narrator is letting us know, and this is not a hospital situation. We are told it is a midwife scenario. Uh, so we don't want to, read it with modern eyes here. This was a midwife's scenario here. And the midwife, we actually get the dialogue here. The midwife says to Rachel, "Don't despair, you have a son." Now, this does bring up a question. I'm curious where you're at on it, Timothy, actually. There's a couple different reasons why the midwife could have said that. Um, One, it could be an encouragement to hang on to life. So she could have been saying, "Hey Rachel, you're almost there. The baby's here, and it's what you wanted. It's a baby boy. Hang on to life, Rachel." And so maybe the midwife is hopeful, encouraging in that sense, or maybe the midwife, with all her experience, knows the truth that Rachel is dying, that she's in fact dying. And what the midwife is doing there is giving to dying Rachel. Here's Rachel leaving this world, then having brought a beautiful baby boy into the world. So, there's a couple different options. Either way, here's the end result. Rachel never lived the dream that she held in her heart ever since she had her first baby boy, Joseph. We know that. She named Joseph Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another one." She wanted us to hold a second baby boy, but instead of actually holding him, she breathes her last and she dies. And the Holy Spirit does tell us that she used her last breath. I mean, think about that. She used her last breath to name the boy Benoni, which is son of my trouble. And this is all very affecting. It's all very affecting, especially to Jacob, as we can all imagine. And the proof of that is that he puts up a monument for his wife. And the narrator says, "Look, it's still there." He wants us to be affected by it. There's Rachel's tomb. And so that's the first scene. And those are my comments on it. And I'll pause, Timothy, to let you in on it too.
Well, it's just these are it's amazing. I'll say it this way. As a pastor, I get to walk into these very intimate moments. Sometimes I'm there when someone dies, or I'm there soon after a baby's born, or just these really intimate, um, decisive life and death moments. And this is a really special thing. It's like the narrator takes the camera into the room as Rachel's dying. We get to hear this dialogue, and we get to see Jacob's reaction. He uses his I always laugh about it, like he uses his dad veto power on the name, and he's like, "No, no, no, no. This isn't son of my trouble. This is my right hand. This is my right hand."
Which is a
And
very rare, and the commentator saw this, that's a very rare move that somebody does this. Very unprecedented almost, this
he's
rename.
so there's something powerful in Jacob, and something really beautiful that he says that my son Benjamin isn't going to be burdened with a name like that. It, maybe he was the son of her trouble, but he's not Jacob's son of his trouble. This is his right hand son, and this is a beautiful, just a very affecting scene. There's no other way of saying it. It does set the stage for uh, later later biblical motifs, and even the slaughter of the holy innocents later, Jeremiah, and then
With
it,
Rachel's tears, yeah.
and then Rachel's tears become a biblical motif that starts right here. So this is a big deal. This ends up in the New Testament then, and becomes a big part of Jesus' life even.
Well, and well, no doubt we'll bring this up later if God gives us the grace to do it. But this also is going to help us massively to understand the context around what happens later in Benjamin's life and the way that Benjamin sat on Jacob's heart. But that's kind of an aside.
Yes, so that's scene number two, and I think what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at this grab bag, this junk drawer of stories, and see how everything's being drawn to a conclusion. But our next story is actually very short. It is a whole verse long. One commentator,
Timothy, mercifully short.
mercifully short.
Thank you,
Uh,
Holy Spirit.
one, at least in the English, it's one sentence long. One commentator called it gnomic for its conciseness. I like that word, gnomic. Um, and just to, give some context for this, Jacob he's vulnerable after the death of his favorite wife, Rachel, and he's full on grieving. You can imagine how he must have been just a broken man. This isn't what he wanted for his life, and his wife Rachel is now gone. So his oldest son, the son of Leah, Reuben, sees this opportunity while his dad is down for the count. He goes in, we're told, um, and it's very direct, blunt language. We're told that Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and we're told then that Jacob heard about it. Now, this is definitely a sexual act. It is, however, I would say a sexual act only secondarily. If it is rather, first of all, and primarily a political act. This was a power move by Reuben, and he was adapting the surrounding nation's cultural moves to declare the leadership of the family. So he was in this moment pushing Jacob aside and saying, "Now I'm leading the family, and I've taken my father's wife to prove it." And so this ties in with the last episode that we did, and on the Genesis chapter 34, where Jacob lost the leadership of his family, and some of that fruit of when he stepped aside then is now bearing its wicked fruit in his life. Now, I'm not saying that Jacob deserved this. He certainly didn't, but he certainly did um, lay some of the stepping stones in Genesis chapter 34. And if you're wondering about that, go and listen back to that um, episode. But this is story number two, vignette number two. And I want to see if you wanted to add anything, Jonathan, to that little story.
Well, only like to buttress the argument you've already made, which is that this is a political act. I think a couple of things that we can think about. You already referenced the sort of, the cultural background of the nations. Uh, this was a practice that if you can conquest another man's woman, and Bilhah would have been Jacob's, that would have been, conquering that man. Uh, and just so, Timothy, so I think sometimes we have this ability to um, pretend like we're morally superior in our day. We're not, you know. Today, actually, this is very mutual between men and women, even on the teenage level. Teenagers, at least in my city, have been known to keep a body count, they call it, when they conquest each other sexually. So this is not um, in if anything, it's more common in our day than in Reuben's day. But that aside, here, why Bilhah? Well, for a couple reasons. One, because this would have been the maidservant of Rachel. and he's the son of Leah. So that provided a political opening right there. Um, and so what's happening there is Bilhah is, along with Jacob, particularly vulnerable because she wouldn't have had Rachel to protect her um, from Reuben, who here is a predator.
Yeah, so this is heavy stuff. Like we go from witnessing the death of a beloved wife to witnessing um sexual exploitation, a political act. This
The,
is
o-
heavy stuff.
the only other thing, and I really want to tell everybody who's listening to this, I'm hesitant to name this out loud, but I'm going to do it out of respect for the biblical text. My hesitancy comes from the fact that Jacob here is a victim. Um, he is he is wronged, but his response actually parallels what happened with Dinah. So here you have another case where there is um, I don't even want to bring language to it, but with Dinah, uh, massive sexual sin in both cases, and Israel responds with a non-answer both times. Now, I'm going to say some things in praise of him later, but I just want to make that clear.
He doesn't forget though. Like we're not going to get to it, but he does when he does address these things. The things that happen in Genesis 34 and 35, he does address them later on his deathbed.
Yes, he does.
And yeah, so the
Then you
next
get
thing that
one last story. And this is a turn in a way to something that is um, there's some real beauty here at the end in this last little vignette. Because what happens here is we do get it. I think you said we do get a closing. We do get an end to the Jacob story. And the end of it is that he's in terms of his location, he's finally back to the promised land. And this is significant in the Bible. It's significant for us. God has promised us land and inheritance in eternity. And we see God keeping his promises here. So he's finally back. He's finally back to the land. He's also back to his father and his brother. So we talked about reconciliation. And it would very much appear, um, and I could be overreading the text, I admit that, but it would very much appear that he gets back just in time. And what a mercy. Jacob does get there when Isaac, his father, breathes his last. And the text very carefully says that he's gathered to his people. And I love that. I don't like I would want very much for our listeners to not read that as a euphemism for death only. That would be totally underreading what the Bible has to say about death and what happens afterwards for believers. What the text is actually saying is that Isaac breathed his last and then was gathered to his people. And so the text is already indicating to us here that death is not the end of us. It is not the end of God's people. He was gathered to his people. And so Jacob gets back to the father he deceived just in time, and his twin brother. And I think this is very beautiful. His twin brother that he had so grievously wronged, they bury their father together. And I think now we'll talk about how there isn't closure for everything, and that's for sure. But isn't it nice that the twin brothers didn't fight? Because they had before. So many other families, you have a patriarch and or a matriarch die, and then everybody fights for the inheritance. We get no word of that, you know? There's no word that they fought over the inheritance. They did that earlier in their lives. They do not do that here. And that's really beautiful. But like I said, it doesn't, not everything's neatly tied up in a bow because Jacob, I mean, if you think about this, Jacob never gets to introduce Rachel to his dad because she had just died. We also know that the Jacob cycle continued. Unfortunately, son hurts father, takes advantage of him when he's vulnerable. Jacob had done it to Isaac, and now Reuben does it to him. There's no closure for that, and there's no closure yet for Dinah. And in fact, the some of the same stuff. And again, I'm not going to repeat it, but some of the same stuff happens again, and so it's an ending. I'm not sure it's closure.
Well, I'll say this about the last, just to build on some of your comments and push into that last little vignette, that last little story. There's two things I think that stand out about the way that the story is told. One is that it's very honest, and it does say, like the last verse that we're considering is in verse 29 there. He breathed his last. So that's very cinematic. That language is
Yes,
very
it is.
cinematic. Like that's I don't know how many of our listeners have been in that situation, but when the chest doesn't rise another time, um, that's we're brought into that moment right there.
Hmm.
And then we're told that he died, which is very honest. I really appreciate like that. That's the Genesis chapter 3 um punishment, or the curse that came as a result of sin. And it's very honest about that. Like these days people don't want to talk about death. There's an Instagram account that kind of mocks that in a certain sense, and it's called They Didn't Die, and they'll post obituaries that will never even mention the word death. Like one of them said, like he went off to play golf in the clouds and things like that. And the biblical account's like, nope, he breathed his last and he died, and then he was gathered to his people. And so I really, there's honesty about like the wages of sin is death, and there's honesty about the resurrection, because Isaac does go on, and he lives with God, and he's gathered to his people. I think that's really beautiful. And then at the very end, I'm gonna call it romantic, because there they are, the two twins, and they're named in their right order. Like the way the text says it sends Esau and Jacob, which is a little bit of a jolt, I think, to us, um, when it's put that way, because we're used to saying Jacob and Esau. But according to age, it is Esau and Jacob. So everything, in a sense, gets put right, and they come together, and they're able to, in peace and joy, bury their dad.